How's it going, everybody? It is Alexandra Hoerr with Optimum Joy, and I have two Optimum Joy extraordinaires. Treshana Lewis and Pamela Larkin are both staff therapists on staff at Optimum Joy. They really specialize in pretty different things, but something that they share in common that we're here to talk about today is grief and loss, which obviously, in light of just normal life, but the year of 2020. So grief is very incorporated in our normal life. I think the more we naturally and normally and in small ways grieve, kind of the better instead of repressed grief. But 2020 was a huge year of loss. So maybe Pam, if you would just really kind of define for us some of how we should think about grief or different types of grief, just as we're kind of like settling into some of this stuff.
Sure, yeah, be happy to talk about that. So when I talk about grief, I look at two types of grief. There's the concrete losses that we've experienced, and then also the symbolic losses. And so, just in defining the concrete losses, that's the things that we see and notice tangibly, right? So, the loss of being together in a relationship with loved ones, coworkers, classmates, the loss of people passing away or losing a baby in pregnancy, the loss of physical and emotional health, the loss of marriages or significant relationships ending. Um, there was also the loss of financial stability and the loss of safety in our community and homes as it relates to domestic and community violence, as well as the fear of COVID that we all continue to kind of experience today. Um, the other type of loss that I like to talk to people about is symbolic losses. And those are really the existential questions of like meaning and purpose in our world. So when we look at the loss or questioning of our identities, and especially keeping our identities or parts of ourselves separate, right? So for the parent who had to merge, their work life and caring for their kids and no longer having kind of that transition in between. Um, we also see the loss of our experience of self-sufficiency and productivity, the loss of hope that things will ever look the same again, and the loss of celebrating transition. So, or transitions in the way that we would usually have experienced those.
Yeah. I think that that's a really important, I don't know if you have anything to say about this, Trishana, but I think that's a really important um, categories to note because I personally have seen that people only categorize grief and loss as the first one, the kind of real,
Mhm,
or how you said that they're like concrete.
mhm,
It's literally like something was there and now it's not there. That
mhm,
that is how like people normally kind of put grief in the box. But because we're human beings and it's all wrapped up about like who am I in the world? What's my purpose?
mhm,
Is the world safe? What can I hope? It's like all of those kind of, they're internal and there's like that residue or resonance that comes from them. And
mhm.
I find that usually loss is a mix of concrete and symbolic,
Yep.
and yeah, that is just important that people don't normally tune into the symbolic loss as much. Would you guys think that's true, or
No, I totally agree. I
Mm,
agree with you on that.
yeah. I think that's especially, I mean, in COVID, with it being so much loss,
mhm,
important to, just the fact that it's like, oh man, I even like you take real death, somebody who actually maybe passed away from COVID or not, and just not being able to do the
mm,
transition, like you're saying, Pam, of going to a funeral.
mhm,
Actually move through really regular community practices too.
mhm, mhm,
Um, what about, this is something, Pam, I don't know if you didn't say this as a category, but I know you as a clinician, and I know
mhm,
there's really kind of like a third category on there when it comes to complicated grief. Is
mhm.
this the same or different from what we're already talking about?
I think that with complicated grief, it's really when those losses lead to feeling debilitated in our ability to function in this world. The Mayo Clinic defines it as painful emotions that are so long lasting and severe that you have trouble recovering from the loss and resuming your own life. So especially as we look at, it was kind of one loss after another and just not feeling like we could catch our breath. I think that is complicated grief.
Mhm. You know what it reminds me of? So my family, my mom grew up in San Diego. So when we were kids, sometimes we would visit. And the Pacific Ocean is different than any other ocean I've ever been in. The waves are really intense and the water is super cold and it's super
Mhm.
salty. It's kind of a harsh, I love it. It's my favorite. But if you don't go over or under a wave in the right way and you get stuck in that spin
Mhm.
bottom and then you come up, but another wave hits you and you get stuck, it's
Mhm.
the kind of like I can't exactly come up for air. I'm just like stuck in this swirling, kind of scary. I don't know when it's gonna end. It feels really isolating. If you just get like really kind of stuck in it. And that's when you just said that, that's the image that comes to mind for me is like the wave of grief keeps
Mhm.
people
Mhm.
in that way.
Mhm. And it reminds you of the wave of grief from before, right? Because what's true is that when we experience loss, it's not just the loss in that moment, but it kind of reconnects us to loss that we've experienced in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, all of us here are mental health providers. So taking into account the history of a person, not only the losses before, but any symptoms you experience. We think symptoms as like anxiety, depression, all that stuff, but it's like all of that starts to stack. When I think complicated in mental health, I think it starts to stack. It's not just
Mhm.
one kind of isolated symptom. It's more kind of like there's a lot going on. And that takes a little bit longer to piece out for
Mhm. Mhm.
people. Um, You know, what about, I don't know, do you have anything else you'd want to say in regards to that stuff, Pam? Just kind of what grief is and how we come to think about it?
No, I think that we'll start to look at what grief like looks and feels like in our bodies and in our relationships as we continue to talk.
Yeah, perfect. So, Trishana, really, what people are probably most familiar with when they hear about grief is the stages of grief. But
Mhm.
if you walk through that, what are some maybe even just like practical examples that people could take a word, like whatever stage of grief is, and actually distill it down to like, this is what it looks like in people's lives?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So before I actually get into the stages of grief, I want to talk about like the many factors that affect an individual's ability to endure through grief. And I think you guys talked about that already. Part of it is the amount of grief that they have already experienced. So their history with grief, as well as the environment around them. Like you can only imagine like experiencing grief in the midst of a pandemic, right? Like
Mhm.
that is such a unique, complicated, weird environment to experience grief in. It also, your personality and your coping style really affects your ability to uh, endure grief, as well as the support systems that you have around you uh,
Mhm.
when you're in the midst of grief and experiencing that. So also, as you're thinking about, the stages of grief, I'm going to try to do a quick synopsis of each stage because it can get very complex.
Mhm.
So first stage is denial. And this is kind of categorized by like just trying to suppress the loss, not acknowledging it, maybe avoiding it.
Mhm.
Some would equate it to shock or numbness. And some researchers even said that this is the survival stage of grief. The numbness actually helps you get over the loss and not kind of lose your way.
Mhm.
Um, then you get into the stage of anger and you begin to ask yourself these questions like, why me? Life is not fair. But it's important to know that these questions are healthy and they have to be endured, and anger has to be expressed and released in order for the healing process to begin. And then a lot of people, they find themselves in the bargaining stage. And once they get to the bargaining stage, it's as making statements like, if only I would have done this, then
Mhm.
they would stay here. Or if only I would have spent more time with them, they would have stayed a little longer, or they would have known I love them. And, this stage it can be dangerous if it's not done within healthy parameters and boundaries. But it is also healthy in the process of moving through grief. Then you may find yourself in a state of anger. Depression. And in that's like the grief kind of turning inward towards yourself. It can be consuming. It's the days where you feel like you just can't get out of bed. It's the days when you just want to withdraw and not really want to be around people. It's the days where it just seems foggy and you really can't see life clearly. And in that stage, in any stage of grief, really, it is important to have support systems around you that will sit with you no matter what stage you're in. But as you continue to move through grief, hopefully you'll begin to get to the stage of acceptance. And that's where you begin to accept life as it is, the reality of the loss, and accepting maybe your new role, your new purpose or direction in life without the person or thing that was once there. And I always like to identify the fact that grief is not a linear thing. Processing grief is not linear, and it may look different for every person. So you may go from denial to bargaining, and then hop to depression, and then anger. And it just may be just a mixing pot of a whole lot of different things. But I think as long as you sit through the process and allow the wave of grief to wash over you and allow people to support you in that space, that you can move through that grief in a healthy way, where you're able to see life with hope and expectancy.
Now, what's interesting, Treshana, I go to church with her, and she is a therapist, and she was telling me that when they originally discovered the stages of grief, which makes us think I go through one stage and then the next, and then I graduate to the next stage, and then I move all the way, and then I'm done grieving. And she was telling me historically, and I haven't actually looked this up, I'm pretty sure it's true, but I'm not 100% confident on it. But when they were originally doing that research, it was in a essentially like chronic medical unit of a hospital where people truly were on their, and I think it was with elderly as well, as an elderly population, chronically ill, who were truly kind of on their way towards death. And as they were noticing people in that very like limited population, as they're noticing the way they would process their just like how does an individual person deal with it as they're headed towards the end of their life, they did notice that it was kind of, they would go through this similar pattern. But I think we have to remember that we people, we're not on our deathbed, we're actually called to live, still called to live life, and that we aren't going to just progress through those stages in a linear function until we're done grieving. It's more like, well, one day it hits me this way, and then it's this way, and then it comes out sideways. It's actually more all over the place. It's not even just cyclical. It's kind of all over the place. That's because it's a little more complicated to grieve and to let go of something and to still walk forward in life. That holding those two things makes life, it's hard. It really has to call us to be present, I think, and truly like humane with ourselves, because we're not at the end.
Yeah,
So
that's good. Well said.
thanks. I really need to look up and make sure that is true, but it sounds important. So,
It sounds true.
like it's true. We're called to live. So practically, ladies, as you kind of distill down this information, what does this look like practically for people in their lives? What are some things we can kind of give them or recommend? Obviously, besides the fact that it's like, just be present to your grief and let it come and go as it needs to be. If it's complicated, maybe you need to get a professional person to wrap tight around you, whether it's therapy or anything like that. And then support, I heard you say other people need to just like sit with you in that's enough. They don't have to tell you advice or anything like that. They just need to sit with you in it. But I've already heard you say those things very practically. What else can people engage in with their grief?
So yeah, there are a couple of things that I even do with some of my clients. One of them is letter writing to grief itself.
Mm,
Uh, and sometimes even writing to the person or thing that you lost.
mm,
Um, Letting them know what life is like without the person or thing. And you're writing it as if you're writing to that person and if they're there in the flesh. Um, I encourage people to write about what it's like to experience a loss, what they hope life will be like without that thing or person in their life.
mhm,
Another thing is a memory box. So, or even doing something like collages to commemorate the person or thing that was once there. Um, I love the arts, so I always encourage, utilizing music,
mhm,
dance, as well as like poetry and stuff like that to verbalize and express, bring to life the emotions that are sitting underneath your grief.
mhm,
And I think that it's really important to highlight that there are customs and cultures, religious and different religions that make space for grief. So
mhm,
if you have a culture or a religion or even spiritual practices that make space for grief and already have some maybe like rhythms that help you to honor those who have died or honor things that are no longer present, engage in those things. And of course, lamenting. Allow yourself to lament. In the US, I feel like we live in a culture, maybe 2020 shook us up a little bit, where we had to realize, hey, we have to face our grief, exist in our grief. But prior to that, I think we live in a culture that really circumvented grief and
mhm,
just kind of keep it moving, go back to work, keep busy, don't
mhm,
stop.
Pull yourself
Um,
your
but
bootstraps.
mhm,
put yourself up by your bootstrap, will yourself together, will yourself to health. And it's okay to lament.
mhm,
It's okay to lament. It's okay to grieve and
mhm,
just sit in whatever emotions that arise uh,
mhm,
as you're experiencing grief.
mhm.
Yeah,
One
sad.
thing that I really go ahead.
I was just gonna.
I was gonna.
This is how it goes between me and Pam. I'm always interrupting her poor thing. I was just gonna say sadness, fear, depression, all those different things are, I always think sad, mad, glad, scared
Mhm,
as like the four basic ones. Sometimes it's like maybe you're gonna feel all of those in one moment. That's the only thing I was gonna say. Pam.
mhm. Well, I think that with lamenting, at least when I think about in the Christian faith, there are often lamenting is acknowledging the suffering that you're experiencing, but also acknowledging the hope that you have, and God being able to redeem you or to care for you or to give you comfort. And so I think, Alex, you said this earlier, but that both of those things can be in the room at the same time. In the same way that with grief, it doesn't mean that you don't have moments of joy and happiness and gratitude. Um, Both of them can be in the room at the same time. And so that is something that I really enjoy about or appreciate about lamenting.
Yeah. I also think that, in light of that, it's important to not fight those moments of joy uh,
Mm-hmm.
and not suppress moments of gratitude or hope and expectancy,
Mm-hmm.
but to let them live. I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes when you're experiencing grief, you feel like you have to be sad all the time,
Yeah.
or you have to um, be missing or longing for the person to return. But
Mm-hmm.
there may be a season where you have come to that acceptance and you don't long for them to return. You do miss their presence, but you live life with joy. So allow whatever it is to enjoy
Mm-hmm.
whatever that experience is for you.
Good word, ladies. Good word.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, uh, sometimes I think, man, I would love for you guys to be my therapist. Is what I think sometimes. You guys are probably have more people on your caseload than you can probably meet with, so I don't need to see you as as my therapist. But I think that there's just a lot of kindness and wisdom and compassion and like just knowledge that has come out of what you are sharing today. So I really appreciate
Mhm.
collective wisdom, you know, pulling three minds together to talk about grief, and really just hope that like people find it helpful, even if it's like one small nugget that helps them kind of sit with their grief, understand their grief a little better, um, and just value. You know, I maybe we'll just end with this. I used to tell my clients all the time, you know what, a great loss or great sadness usually comes with great love. And
Mhm.
so, if any of us are really overwhelmed with a great loss in some way, shape, or form, whether it's symbolic or concrete loss, just to remember it's like, wow, there was actually a great love wrapped up in that. And it's
Mhm.
kind of that, you know, it's better to love and lose than to not love at all. So I really
Mm.
appreciate you ladies. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah.
Thank you. You too.